Good morning. My name is Billy Still, and I'm happy to be here today. I was the senior pastor at St. Paul's around the corner and down the street for about 15 years, and I'm retired now and enjoying that so much. Candace, yesterday, ran the Monument Valley 50-kilometer trail run, about 31 miles. And you'll want to know, so you can make a big deal out of it when she comes back next week, that she won her age group. And so clap for her. And I will tell you, and you can tell her this too, I'm not going to volunteer what age group that was. Not because there's anything wrong with any particular age group, I'm just not confident, and I wouldn't want to accidentally make her older than she is. But she won her age group. She had a great day. It's a beautiful course. I've run it before, and it was a great, marvelous place to be. And thank you for welcoming me so much here. I mean, you should be glad. Candace is a great pastor. Has been a good friend for a long time. But Paige is doing a great job running the show, too. So you should give her a pat on the back. So... Gabby Barquet is a name that you don't know, or it's be really unusual if you knew his name. He remains, though he's mostly emeritus in his position now, the primary biblical archaeologist for the nation of Israel. So it's a big deal to be a biblical archaeologist in Israel, a bigger deal than pretty much anywhere else. And he tells this story. It's a marvelous story. In 1979, he was greeting a tour group of students. And what they often did there, what he did, and what people do all over the world, is you bring students into an archaeological site where most of the big work has been done. Now, in archaeology, you can't ever know, right? Because things are hiding. You don't know what's hiding underneath or behind something. But as far as he could tell, the big work had been done. So at the very least, anything that was exposed and fragile had been cared for, and the kids were not going to damage anything. And so there was a little boy, and his name was Nathan, and he just wouldn't leave Barquet alone. Just pulling on his shirt sleeve, pulling on his pants leg. What about this? What about that? Can I do this? Can I do that? Finally, Barquet said, I had to do something. I wasn't going to get anything done. And so he gave the little boy 2 brushes, and he took him into a room, and he said, pretend that this floor is your mother's kitchen floor, and she has asked you to clean it. And after you finish cleaning it, you're going to eat a meal off the floor. So work hard. And Nathan was a kid that didn't like to sit around anyway, so he thought this was the greatest thing in the world, and he went to work scrubbing. I forgot to mention that this was just outside the traditional wall close to the Scottish Church of St. Andrew, for those of you who've been there. And so it's a well-known site. So Nathan began to work, and Barquet began to do some other things with some other students and think, well, he'll be there for hours and hours, and less than an hour later, he's pulling on his sleeve again. Barquet thinks, Nathan, and he turns around, and there's his little boy, and he's holding in both hands an absolutely pristine pot. 2 of them. So Barquet gasped, oh my gosh, where did you get those? And he said, well, I was scrubbing the floor, like you said, and there was a loose piece of tile, so I took it out so I could screen it better, and I looked down, and there are a bunch of these under there. Well, it was one of the greatest finds in biblical archaeology ever. And so the silver scrolls that were inside these pots, this was 1979, they've not been able to unfold all of them, even though they've worked on it for a very long time. But when they did unfold one of them, here's one of the things they found: the oldest rendering of the word Yahweh, a Hebrew name for God, ever found anywhere. And they also found that in these pots, which were dated roughly from the time of Jeremiah, so 2,700 years before they were found under the floor, older than the Dead Sea Scrolls. As far as we know, we were still working on the Dead Sea Scrolls, so older than the bulk of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And there was a blessing, the oldest rendering of this blessing from the 6th chapter of what we now call Numbers, was written there. Many of you will know it as if you grew up in the church. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious unto you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. I love this story, and I love thinking about it because this is what I believe. None of us are ever finished plumbing the depths of the spiritual life. I mean, you never finish. You don't know what's under the next layer of stuff that if you find yourself able to peel it back, you don't know what you're going to find. All of us have a hidden burial chamber of unresolved issues, as well as unimaginable beauty and endless possibility if we take the time to dig. And so the persistence of Nathan can be exhausting. It can be tiring to us and to others, but it inevitably opens the door to new life. Today is the first Sunday in the season of Lent. It's a season that is designed for just this kind of thing as we prepare for the resurrection, to dig deep under the burial chambers of our hearts and find what is alive there that can be stirred to new life. Some of you who go to different kinds of meetings during the week know that you're invited from time to take a fearless moral inventory of your life. And we're also invited to take a fearless spiritual inventory of our life. Do you take up, is it part of your tradition to take up a particular Lenten practice, to give up something for Lent or to take up something for Lent? I wasn't raised with that tradition, but for the last 40 years or so, a long time, it's been very important to me. And so there were years that I gave up coffee, years that I gave up chocolate and other sweets, years that I gave up a meal, the midday meal every day during Lent, and took that time to read Scripture and to pray. One year I decided, and my wife had to participate in this, and she did, that we would give up television for Lent, which, I even felt guilty when I said it because I don't like television very much, so I don't watch very much television, so it was a big deal to her, but it didn't feel like much of a deal to me until I realized I had not explored the question very deeply, and I had just stood in front of the church and promised to give away the NCAA basketball tournament. The whole thing that year, including the finals. But I did. I'd announced it in public. What are you going to do? And so I gave it up and gave that time for prayer and Scripture. I gave my car up one year for Lent. I was a pastor at the time, so I had the exception. Sunday morning or your daughter's wedding. I would not come on my bicycle dressed poorly, but I would dress nicely and come in a car. I've taken up things for Lent. Have you ever done that? Taken up doing something? And so one year I decided every day I would read the Sermon on the Mount. 5th, 6th, and 7th chapter of Matthew. And I'm doing that again this year. I'm doing it primarily this year because, just our culture's starting to feel a little fragile, don't you think? And it's a little rough around the edges, and it's not very difficult to get into a harsh conversation or to be drawn into one, either on social media or face-to-face, and I don't want to do that and don't find it helpful. And so reading the Sermon on the Mount every day changes the way I think. It's different from reading it once to reading it 40 times consecutively. It begins to take on a new life. Last year I read a history of the Christian church. I didn't think about that one very carefully ahead of time either. I couldn't get it done during Lent. I spent an hour a day reading it, but it was a massive tome that I set aside. But I did eventually finish it. I noticed on your website there's a suggestion from someone, I don't know who, that they're going to take a picture that represents new life. They're going to take a photograph every day and post it on their various social media pages. Well, stop now for just a moment and imagine a spiritual practice you could take up or set aside for this Lent, and think about where it might lead you. If something came to mind where you said, oh, I could do this, and you immediately went, no, that's too much, that's probably what you should do. Well, Gabby Barquet was given a lecture, and it was 10 years after his event with Nathan, and he was given a lecture, which he does. He's a really personable, engaging fellow. So he's given a lecture, and after it's over, he noticed that there was a young Israeli soldier If you've been to Israel, almost all Israeli soldiers are young because people go into the military right out of high school to fulfill an obligation. So this is young Israeli soldier, and he comes up to speak to Barkay after it's over. And Barkay said, "You seem to be unusually interested in biblical archaeology." He said, I am. I was inspired by a great teacher when I was young. My name is Nathan. And I want you to know that every night when my son goes to bed, we sit on the side of the bed and offer this blessing. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious unto you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. When I think of the gospel reading that we heard, the feeding of the 5,000, it's clear to me that Andrew's question was driven by fear. It was a fearful question. Oh no, what is so little that we have among so many people? What are we going to do? Henry Nouwen often said that fearful questions never lead to loving answers. Fearful questions never lead to loving answers. We're too afraid to love freely. And if Andrew's fear had been embraced on that day, imagine growing up reading in the Bible the story of the feeding of the 12. That's not much of a story, is it? Right? And so, but maybe 13 because they would have wanted to feed Jesus too, right? 12 disciples, you want to let Jesus in on it. And probably 14, I mean, you couldn't take the 5 loaves and 2 fishes from the little boy and not let him have a bite. And so Andrew could have written the story of the feeding of the 14. But Jesus wanted to know this, that the way you answer the question posed by Andrew goes a long way toward defining how you live your life. I mean, if you live your life saying, well, Andrew, what was the implication that Andrew had was, okay, we've got 5 loaves and 2 fishes, there are 12, well, 13, 14 of us. Why don't we just step over the hill, out of sight, and eat lunch? I mean, we don't have enough lunch for everybody, so there's no reason that we should go hungry. I mean, he's Jesus, so we should feed Jesus, right? That's the right thing to do. And Jesus' response was, feed all the people, and then take baskets to gather up the leftover bread, and they filled 12 baskets. Every time our community, or anyone else's community, feels a call from God to reach out boldly in love, the voices of fear rise up and say, don't do that, there's not enough. We have to take care of ourselves first, you see. And when we take care of ourselves first, if there's anything left over, well, of course we'll give it away. But of course, if you manage it that way, there's never anything left over because 14 people could eat 2 loaves of bread, huh? Of course they could. And so we're invited to silence these voices of fear with extreme generosity, and our spirits are formed by the way we decide to respond to hold on or let go, give or protect, scarcity or abundance. Andrew looked at the situation and he saw the absolute minimum possibility. I think we could feed ourselves. Jesus looked at the same situation and saw vast, endless possibility, and encourages us to never close our imaginations to a sense of wonder. God always has a surprise on the horizon for those who are willing to see it. It's not our job to be gatekeepers to the possibility of God deciding who gets in and who gets out. We are called to stand by the gate and keep it open. When I was at St. Paul's, there was a period of time, not the whole time, but a period of time where we had a small worship service on Sunday night. And at this worship service, almost everybody there was previously unchurched. Or if they had grown up in a church, as children, they'd not been in a church except for weddings and funerals and stuff for, say, 10 years. And so we worked really hard to be careful not to use like church language, that you have to be an insider to know what it is. And so if I had told or read this story from John at that service, I would have said, this is in the 6th chapter of John. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are the first 4 books of the New Testament. They're called Gospels, and they tell the story of Jesus' life. And so people would go, oh, okay, and be glad to hear that. So we're going to serve communion. And I had explained it, and I was feeling pretty good about myself. I explained it in a way where anybody would understand. And then I was at a stool in the front of the church, and I stood up, and just without thinking at all, I said, "And now come and meet me at the table." And I went and walked around the table to hold up the bread and the cup and to break them and offer the liturgy. And I was saying a prayer, and my hands were spread out like this, and all of a sudden, if you had this happen, I knew somebody was standing beside me. You just sense it, you know. And so I kind of turned, and there was a young woman I'd never seen before standing there, looked like she was in her early 20s. I clicked my microphone off and said, "Hey." And she said, "Well, this is the table, right?" I said, "Yes." She said, "The table. You said to come meet you at the table. This is the table, right?" I said, "It is. And so why don't you just wait a second while I prepare the meal, and then we'll share it together." So I finished the liturgy and did all the stuff and broke the bread and broke the cup and turned and shared the bread and the cup with her. And then she took the loaf from my hand and broke the bread and gave it to me, and she served me. So she goes and she sits down. We finish the service. At the end of the service, she's sitting in the back, and so I went really fast so I could catch her and introduce myself before she got to her car. And I did, and she said the most interesting thing. She said, "I was really self-conscious up there, you know." And I said, "Yeah, I guess." And you're thinking, now you know why she was self-conscious, right? Well, thank goodness I didn't act like I knew. And I asked her, "Why were you self-conscious?" And she did not say, "Because I went up at the wrong time to the wrong place in front of everybody." She said, "Because I had heard of communion, but I'd never taken it before. But I knew that when the bread touched my lips, something was going to happen. And I was afraid everybody would see it. And I wouldn't know what to do, and I'd be embarrassed. So I was self-conscious, waiting for something to happen." So I listened, and I said, "Well, what happened?" And she had an answer that a regular church person never would have given at any point in our life. She looked at me, and she said, "I quit smoking." And I said, "It's only been 10 minutes. How do you know?" She laughed, and she said, "Well, because I hate this death-dealing habit." She said, "It makes everything I own stink and smell bad, and the people that love me back up when I walk into the room, and my health is terrible, and this is the reason why. And I've tried over and over and over to walk away from it, and I can't. But when the bread touched my lips, something in the core of my being flipped over, and there was just this lightness and this breeze that blew through me, and I knew at that moment I would never want to damage this gift of God that's my body like that again." So I quit right then, 10 minutes ago. And I wasn't going to argue with her, right? It was so beautiful. I had tears running down my cheeks. She said, she said, I guess you just never know when you put the bread to your lips. Is it like that all the time for everybody? Maybe. Maybe not. I don't know. But I know this. What I do know is that John Wesley, Brother Wesley, said that when we take the sacrament, that it speaks to us at our particular place in the spiritual life. And so if you're a person, as she was, who wasn't even sure, we became friends for a little while. She wasn't in town long, but we spent some time together. And she wasn't even sure that she would call herself a Christian. I mean, she was just exploring this for the first time in her life. She didn't really know what that meant. But what she knew was something happened when she came to that service. So as long as she was in town, she kept coming. And so in her case, we could say that the sacrament was an act of evangelism, drawing her to Christ. For the very first time, when she had no language to explain it, she just had this experience that meant something really important. And that we could come for the sacrament and we could ask God to empty us of whatever is keeping us from digging down and plumbing the depths of our spiritual life, and that God might fill us up with something new, that as we take this sacrament this morning, that we might come to believe that the resources of God are a great abundance to be freely shared, never to be hoarded, and that they are not a scarcity. We're not going to run out. So our most loving and gracious God, we thank you for coming to us. We thank you for the word that you have for us. We thank you that the feeding of the 14 became the feeding of the 5,000, and we pray that our lives can reflect the same kind of commitment to great generosity that rises out of our life with you. Thanks be to God. Amen.